very good evening. I think it's afternoon or morning from where you are, to Professor Mark McCaughrean and Professor Vandana Singh. So I'll just do a little intro for both of you that I've collected, and then we can move on with the conversation.
Sure.
So Professor McCaughrean, Senior Advisor for Science and Exploration at the European Space Agency, co-founder of Space Rocks. So, sir, could you tell us a little bit more about Space Rocks? It sounds really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come on this afternoon. I'm speaking from the Netherlands, where it is indeed the afternoon. So, yeah, I work for the European Space Agency, and obviously we have to talk about all of the missions that we fly to explore the universe, to go to the nearest planets, to do Earth observation and look down at planet Earth as well. And there's a big responsibility for us for outreach. So how do we bring that to the general public? And one of the ways we do that, out of many, is this thing called Space Rocks, where we bring together scientists, engineers, astronauts with musicians, writers, filmmakers, thinkers, cultural people who can bring us a different perspective on the sorts of things we're doing, and vice versa, that we can engage them in the sort of work that we're doing in the European Space Agency. And those are live events where we bring the public to listen to speakers and to hear bands playing and to watch films. In the last year, of course, that's been all done online. So we have a weekly chat where we talk to people from all of those fields, engineers, scientists, musicians, writers, filmmakers, actors, called Uplink. We've been doing that for a year now. So yeah, it's been fantastic working with people from across the broader cultural domain for interesting discussions, and I hope we'll have some of that this afternoon as well.
Yeah, I think this is right up the alley of, science communication in general. And so I would like to ask Professor Vandana Singh a few questions. It says, so from your own bio, from your own website, I picked up this, which sounded very interesting. A writer of speculative fiction and not just science fiction. So could you explain what you mean by speculative fiction?
Well, that's a good question. I hope you can hear me all right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there are actually many definitions of speculative fiction, but my definition essentially is that it's a broad umbrella-like term that encompasses science fiction, fantasy, magic realism, various other kinds of imaginative literature.
Lovely. And I think one of your works is quite curiously named Ambiguity Machines and Other Stories. So is this a reference to quantum computers in some way? Or
No, not at all. It's hard to describe, but that's definitely in the arena of more speculative fiction. That's kind of, I would say, a blend of science fiction and fantasy. So that particular short story is up on the internet, and but it also titles my book of short stories, which is I don't have in front of me right now the edition that's available in India from Zuban Books, but it's there, same name.
Okay. So very warm welcome to both of you, and I think so. I was thinking, like, both of you are scientists by profession, but one of you has, both of you have sort of chosen science communication as something that you want to be heavily involved with. So I would like to ask, open the discussion by asking you, what kind of an exchange do you see between science and science fiction? How do they inform each other, influence each other? So either of you, if you would like to answer that question.
So why don't you go ahead? Yeah, Professor Singh.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go ahead? Okay, I can start. Well, it's that relationship has a long history. And I think for me, in particular, not being a scholar of science fiction studies, but being a perpetrator of science fiction, that the relationship to me, one of the key things about it is that both things, science, particularly space science and science fiction, have in common a sense of wonder about the universe in which we find ourselves. And realist fiction is just so blind to the rest of the non-human universe, whether it's other non-human species on the planet or the possibility of aliens on other worlds, but also to the physical universe. And and I think science fiction does this beautiful job of really asking our relationship with the cosmos as a whole, which was a role that perhaps ancient epics played once, but we don't have any other uh, equivalent of it than science fiction in modernity. So I think it helps us relate the human to the cosmological. And it does that very well through evoking this common sense of wonder that we share with science. Um, and it allows, to some extent, it allows a certain, anticipatory imagination to develop. So there are a few examples. For instance, Arthur C. Clarke famously came up with the idea of geostationary satellites well before, such things came into being. And yet we take them for granted today. But the idea behind science fiction isn't really prediction. And in fact, the future is often used as a metaphor to describe aspects of our current present situation, perhaps exaggerate one aspect of it and say, what if human beings were like this? Or what if our relationship with the cosmos or with technology was like that? So that's one of the things that science fiction does. And then lastly, the other thing that science fiction can do, and this relates to what Mark was saying about gathering people, including artists and musicians, into the fold of scientific discovery. Because one of the things that the canvas of science fiction does is to allow us to explore ethical questions and ask deep philosophical questions that might yet inform, and at least that's my hope, how we go into space, what we do when we get there, and all of those sort of things.
That's a very interesting point. So, Professor McCaughrean, how would you describe the influence that your interaction with artists and musicians have had through this experience of, space rocks?
Well,
how does that inform your?
Yeah, if I just go, sort of back to the beginning when I was a kid, right? I mean, so when this film in the background here, this is 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is Space Station 5, which of course gives the implication that there are actually 4 other ones at least. So it's not the only space station in space. Today we have effectively one international space station. It's not a big centrifuge like this. So the astronauts are floating in microgravity as opposed to being able to walk around in 1G. But, we're there. Okay. And it's been in orbit for 20 years. So almost, in a sense, 2001, 2021, if you do the maths, the International Space Station was around when this was there. And, of course, there's some prosaic things in that film to do with going to the moon, digging holes in the moon, discovering things on a journey to Jupiter. And we've been to Jupiter, and the European Space Agency is sending a new mission back to Jupiter in the next couple of years. So many of those things are parallel. But then there's that broader philosophical question, of course, about are we alone in the universe? What would our interaction be if we did encounter aliens? And of course, in the film, very cleverly, you actually don't encounter aliens. This was something that was removed in very early stages. They tried to work on it, and Stanley Kubrick sort of figured it's too ridiculous, right? People are going to focus on what these aliens look like, not what they bring in philosophical terms, where we have stepped over some boundary. We are sort of now, the initial monolith is about some kind of seeding of intelligence or encouragement of intelligence. And now when we've got to the moon and discovered the other monolith, we've sent a signal out that we're ready to be admitted into some kind of galactic club. Now, in ESA, we don't do any of that. That's not in our remit, to join the galactic club. We are looking for life elsewhere in the universe, and we've found planets around other stars. So there are aspects which are true. But as Vandana said, at some point these questions become very critical. What are the ethical dimensions? What are the philosophical dimensions? things like going to the moon and particularly going to Mars, where there might be life already. What is the ethical dilemma that we have, where if we go to the planet and we bring our life and our life forms, we risk a kind of a genocide. Perhaps we may wipe out life that exists there already. And how do we do that? Should we go? Should we leave it as a park and let it be? Of course, we're trying to discover whether that life is there or not, but almost by doing the experiment, there's always a risk that we contaminate the planet. And I think we need to engage the public and philosophers and writers and thinkers much more than, or just as much as scientists, because scientists quite often, or engineers, as I am a scientist, but some of us can be very literal minded and say, well, who cares? Let's just go and do it. It's like, well, it's a bigger question than that. And so through Space Rocks and other things that we do in outreach, we try to engage those because we are making decisions effectively on behalf of the whole of humankind and, in some sense, other species that we don't even know the names of yet. So that can't just be the scientists and the engineers making those decisions.
That's a very thoughtful thing to think about. Like, how do you inform the ethics of science through sci-fi? So it does provide like a basis for imagination, but I feel that in most science fiction films or books that I've read, the aspect of them that I've found most interesting is the reflection of the technology on society at large, as in things like a recent series called The Expanse, which explores this spacefaring civilization of ours sometime in the remote future. They have created this sort of class hierarchy based on people who are born in outer space and thus have lower bone density and things like that. So, I mean, as a science fiction author, you have to build this entire universe. How do you think about the interlinking of these different aspects when you're building this universe, Professor Singh?
Well, that's one of the joys of the creative enterprise, and because it's not just creating future technologies and speculating on science as we know it and science as we don't know it, which is a ton of fun to do. But also you have to create cultures, and you have to create believable cultures. So if you look at classic science fiction in the West, especially in North America, it reads very dated, in part because they forget to change cultures and to recognize that one, cultures are different on Earth, and two, they're always in change from one form to another. And so, you'll have stories that are set in some remote future. And I'm thinking of Isaac Asimov and other classic writers here, where, the women, for instance, will be doing things like cooking dinner for their husbands and playing a 1950s gender stereotype role, And one would hope that any kind of positive future would have a more egalitarian relationship between the genders. So when we build worlds, we really have to think about alternatives to our current social arrangements as well. And sometimes that involves coming up with entire inventions of religions and mythologies and belief systems and so on and so forth. And in fact, Asimov himself, who has a wide variety of stories, has a beautiful classic story called Nightfall, which actually illustrates my point very well, where the story is really about how the paradigm in which this civilization has come up on this planet is completely shattered by an astronomical event, and how the people react to that. So building alternate societies, building paradigms, as well as not limited to the scientific technological. I think that's a large part of what science fiction can do. And one of the interesting things that has happened in science fiction, particularly in the 70s, when women writers in North America particularly and in Western Europe started to kind of take it back and complicate it and make it more interesting and make it more literary, so that character development and the development of different kinds of cultures, the anthropological element becomes more important than it ever was before. And now we have a very interesting state of international science fiction, where finally science fiction writers from far-flung corners of the globe, whether it's India or Argentina or Italy or Nigeria, are talking to each other. And in a sense, taking science fiction away from its roots, because much as I love both science and science fiction, I have to be honest and admit that they both have their roots in colonialism. And when you bring in people from different backgrounds, cultures, and so on, then it inevitably enriches the field, whether we're talking about science or science fiction. So I hope I've answered your question, or at least begun to answer it.
Yeah. I wonder Promit, if I can pick up, because that, definitely a couple of topics which are high on my mind. Firstly, you mentioned The Expanse, and you said it's in the distant or the remote future. I don't think it is. I think it's today. I think the important point is, okay, the setting may be hundreds of years in the future, but the questions which are being asked are right now and here today, because they are precisely about what kind of interplay will there be between civil systems and private wealth and private capitalism when it expands into space. And these are exactly the questions being asked by companies like Amazon, like SpaceX and others. What is the model under which we want to proceed into space? And frankly, it looks an awful like sort of fantasy colonialism of the 1950s. I mean, I'm afraid that the boys who are running those companies obviously haven't read anything other than Asimov. They haven't grown up with science fiction at all. I mean, one of the great ironies about The Expanse, well, I mean, we've had two of the actors from The Expanse feature in Space Rocks. So we've had Dominique Tipper, who's Naomi Nagata, and Shorey Agdashlu, who's Avasarala, the head of the United Nations, and we've had very interesting discussions with them, because what the irony was that the show was cancelled at the end of the third season, and it was rescued by Amazon, by Jeff Bezos, who said it was his favorite science fiction film, and I just or series, and I wonder whether he even watched it, because it's so openly critical of the model of capitalism and the hierarchy of the Belters and the Martians and the Earth people, and this idea of some kind of mysterious person trying to use the proto-molecule to get a commercial advantage. It is Jeff Bezos. I mean, and I don't understand why, anyway. So, and the flip side of what Vandana said there, I think, is absolutely vital, that we've seen an increase in both in viewpoints, culturally, gender-wise, broadly diversity-wise. And the one country you didn't mention, which has been fascinating to me in the last few years, is Chinese science fiction. Because, I mean, particularly famously, the three-body problem by Liu Qijin, in which from the first page you're exposed to a world and a culture, which is the Cultural Revolution and the basis for the whole book, which it's not alien to people who live in the West, but it opens up a door to the changes in Chinese culture on a timescale of one generation, not 10 generations, have been astonishingly large. And it's fascinating, because the book takes a very different perspective on what it is to be human than classical Western sci-fi, where pretty much everybody, you're either a bad person or a good person. There are no good people or bad people in that book. There's very fallible people who make bad decisions and good decisions. And, and Chinese science fiction opens up a new avenue for us to consider the future. Because to be honest, this maybe sound openly critical, the future is not American. The future is Chinese, it's Indian, it's the world. And we need to stop thinking about classical manifest destiny science fiction and try to change our viewpoint, because that's going to be the practical reality. The American empire, and I may be criticized for this, the American empire is in decline. It's had its time. It is now the time of new empires, and they are the ones, in the end, I'm afraid, or not afraid, just I think it's true. We need to start thinking about that in a much broader palette of cultural understanding.
So, do you think the science fiction that belongs to a particular language or nation sort of reflects their view of science as a means to control versus a means to understanding? Or, I mean, is that discernible from European, American, or Chinese science fiction? Do you feel that?
Well, let me just pick up quickly on that. I mean, I'm not a science fiction writer, but the other kind of science fiction we haven't discussed is Russian science fiction, and this whole entanglement with cosmism, this very much more spiritual approach to space exploration, which if you look, and I have a book here somewhere of imagery from the early space program in the Soviet Union, is a very different set of philosophical and cultural imagery to that used in the American context, where there were flags everywhere and heroes. Now, there were heroes in the Russian imagery, but it was very different. It was very much more philosophical. So absolutely, I think, and I also realize that when I read Chinese science fiction, I'm reading in translation, and I'm not even sure that I'm necessarily catching all the nuances. And that may well be true, that a lot of stuff is kind of hidden almost in subtext in books. I don't know. I mean, I only ever read science fiction in English, so it's hard for me to know.
Yeah, well, I think these are absolutely fascinating, and emphatic yes to everything you said, Mark, because I really think that this is an exciting time for us to think about space exploration differently, and yet the people who are leading the current new space race, like you said, people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and all, are really going with that old colonialist mindset. There's a friend of mine working on a PhD in space law and policy who points to that, that if you look at the language that they use, then it's filled with this colonialist imagery. And in fact, I was once at an ISS R&D conference where Elon Musk spoke about the need to go to Mars and so on and so forth. But what he said was, we need to sell this idea to the public by making Westerns on Mars. And I mean, some of us just looked at each other and cringed. And so, to add to your beautiful elucidation of what Chinese and Russian science fiction have to give us, there's also this emerging notion of indigenous science fiction, indigenous futurisms that completely, catch that whole colonialist impulse so well. So, for instance, there's a collection of, there's an anthology of short stories by the indigenous academic Grace Dillon, which has collections by Native American writers on their takes, their various perspectives on science fiction, space exploration, and so on. And I think we have a lot to learn from them, because what we can do with space exploration, if we were wise enough to do it, is to actually do it right, and not do it from some kind of a hegemony type impulse, whether it's American hegemony or Chinese hegemony or whatever. I mean, if we can find some way to think about humankind, and not just humankind, but earthlings, kind of extending their biophilia, their appreciation for life and for wonder and for exploration into space, and ask ourselves, why are we going to space? Is it to make a few people even richer than they are now? Or is it for some other reason? And if it's for other reasons, if it's for humanity, if it's for Earth, then why is it that other people don't have a say in this? Why is it that we have a bunch of tech billionaires leading the space race? And who appointed them representatives of humanity? So there's a profound, tragedy for me that if we don't allow other people to have their say, then we risk repeating the horrors of colonialism. Whether it, if you go to the moon or to Mars, it can exhibit in more than one way. Even if we go to a lifeless world where there's perhaps no danger of destroying, other life forms, and the questions we ask and the way we think about it can still be profoundly colonialist. Consider, for instance, in the US, the Space Act of 2015, which allows commercial entities to mine the moon. And I'm not a legal scholar by any means, but I know that this has set off some reverberations in the space law community, because it may be in violation of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which basically says no nation can own any part of space, any celestial body. So, but can we allow commercial entities to own the moon or to mine on the moon and make profit from those things? And what does it mean to allow them access to low Earth orbit? Does that mean that they can also attain military power? There are all those things to think about too. And then consider the fact that modern civilization hasn't solved the problem of waste, right? Waste is a huge problem. Whether you're talking about, the detritus of civilization, or whether you're talking about things like carbon dioxide pollution in the atmosphere, which is, threatening our survival and that of the biosphere. Well, in low Earth orbit, I believe at least 500,000 pieces of junk that are being tracked by NASA. Some of them as tiny as paint flecks, which, because they're traveling at such high speeds, are really a threat to satellites and to any other objects that we put out there. So it seems as though we are carrying our problems with us into space without thinking deeply about what they are and how to solve them. And I think that's with due apology to adolescents, that's not grown-up behavior. So to echo what you said, Mark, it's time we grew up.
Yeah, I think this is sorry, please go on.
No, I was just going to pick up on the space debris issue because, of course, we've almost become so routine now that we almost ignore them. But every few weeks, SpaceX is launching another 60, 70 satellites into low Earth orbit, and there's this completely confused sort of philosophy about it. These low Earth orbit satellites are to provide high-speed internet for the world. And it's always sold, again, on that colonial perspective that you might have it where you live in your city, but there are people in Africa that don't have it. So here we are going to be benevolent and give it away. Well, we're not going to give it away for free, of course. We're going to monopolize it, and we're going to sell it to you, and we're going to take away any local control that you might have over the internet, whether that's political, which, of course, is, the access to information in China, for example, is not the same as it is in the West. But it also takes away the possibility of building a local infrastructure and local control in an economic sense. It just siphons the money and takes it away. But then you realize, so firstly, that takes away then access to the night sky, whether it's for exploration or Earth observation. We have to move our satellites constantly to get out of the way of these things now because there's so many of them. They create the possibility of debris and more debris and junk, which might kill off all of the useful satellites, let's say. There's been this big issue about it also taking away access to the night sky. Something, you just look at the sky and where you might see fixed stars and inspire children, you might now see thousands of satellites, which are bright points moving around. And it removes away a public heritage, if you like, a worldwide one. And now what's become bizarre about this is, of course, you now see Europe and other countries responding. So we can't allow strategic control of something like worldwide internet to belong in American hands or Chinese hands or Russian hands or wherever. So Europe says we now must build a satellite constellation the same. But of course, it's not locally concentrated. It pollutes everybody's sky because they have to fly around the Earth. So even if it's only meant for Europe, everybody has to suffer the consequences. And then the philosophical bizarreness of this is that it's supposed to then bootstrap a Mars colonization program, and I use the word because that's what they use, in order to save humankind from a planet, this one, the one we live on, which is becoming polluted by CO2. It's, even if you send 1 million people to Mars, that's a tiny fraction. It's 1 in 1,000. That means that you and I don't know. I mean, maybe I know 1,000 people. I know one person that's going, right? That's 1 in 10,000. It's even worse if there's 10 billion people on the Earth. So largely, you're saying, I've given up on this planet, and I'm going to send people to that one, Mars, which is frankly utterly inhospitable. Everything we know about it says it's an absolutely miserable place to live. Nobody will enjoy living on Mars if they can survive at all. And yet, so this whole idea, this sort of colonialism of we want to give access to the internet, make loads of money, and then save humankind by taking some rich people off to Mars, and you're not going, by the way, and you're just going to have to suffer on the Earth that we've destroyed through the same model. It beggars belief that this is something which a lot of people support, frankly. I mean, they ought to start reflecting on the system that we live in the world, and how it is that how we even get to pick where people can, individuals, single people, have enough money that they can run space programs that rival the United States or Europe or Russia. I mean, how is that even possible? but that's politics. That's not really science fiction. But science fiction allows us, through The Expanse and written science fiction, allows us to explore the consequences of actions we are taking today. So we really do need more people to, watch the outcomes, and science fiction writers provide that avenue for saying, this is what's going to happen to you.
How do you think this can play back, as in through space exploration, we find more efficient ways of sustaining ourselves and our society? Like Professor Wagner mentioned in the previous talk, how systems become more efficient, the way you recycle water, and become more circular in the production process and processing. So how do you think that can help inform life on Earth, and thereby eliminating the need for colonizing, as they say, or because the argument that they provide is that the prospect of colonization of another planet is what generates that interest, that enthusiasm in society, which pushes these programs forward. But what are your views on that? I mean, is there any other way in which we can get people excited about space programs or space exploration?
I leave that to Vandana first. I just had a little rant, so I'll.
I think there's so many better ways of exciting people about space, especially if, and I like the example you give, and I've spoken to astronauts who have, who been on the ISS, and that's one of the things that they say. And in fact, one of the Apollo missions, the one that, I forget which number mission it was, but the one that orbited the moon and didn't land on it and took the first picture of Earth from space. All of these, we get this notion that when we get away from Earth and we look back on it, we suddenly realize that it's the most important place in the universe, right? And so much as it's so, it's cool to go to other planets and explore them. And, in science fiction, being a science fiction writer, I love exploring those possibilities and imagining different scenarios. And, I remember doing a lot of research and really enjoying writing a story about life on one of those planets that's tidally locked to its star, and, imagining life in the Terminator zone and so on and so forth. So all that is wonderful, I think. And it's not necessarily, I don't know that people are necessarily excited about living on other planets unless they've been massively misled by 50s era science fiction, which paints a much more romantic image of those sort of things than it's possible. I mean, what we forget is our own relationship to the rest of the species on our planet is deeply broken, and we don't appreciate that. And imagine if we were to be plucked from here and taken to Mars, for maybe some time you would be, oh, wow, look at this, it's so cool. But the fact is that we've evolved with other organisms around us, the tree outside my window, the bird that's singing despite the cold, and all of that. And that means something to us. So one of the things that I think the first space missions did was to have us recognize the beauty and uniqueness of our own planet. And that's partly why I know NASA and ESA have a lot of missions that look back at the Earth and study Earth, including climatic effects and so on. But I do like this notion of how, when you're in a orbiting satellite, you cannot afford to junk up the place. You have to think in this circular way. And that is a lesson for our planet. And it's a lesson that we had, and many indigenous communities, for instance, still have, that, that we are an island. The Earth is an island. The Earth is a satellite swimming through space. And we simply can't foul it up. That would not only be a terrible thing to do, but it's a profoundly stupid thing to do to our only home. So I think that notion of that lesson of circularity and the lesson of respecting every resource you have so that you don't waste it is something that we've forgotten. And space, a space philosophy that rests on the wisest foundations can indeed help inform life on Earth and how we go forward. But a space philosophy that's like cowboys in space is not going to do it.
Look, I completely agree, and I think that idea of reflecting on our position in the universe is perhaps the greatest gift that space exploration can bring. If it doesn't inspire a degree of humility and a degree of insignificance, but also marvel at the fact that we have evolved to a point where we can comprehend the universe in some sense, that we can use telescopes, we can use probes, we can go to places with machinery or with photons, that we can understand the enormous scale of the universe, the enormous inhospitability of the universe, the fact that it isn't welcoming for us, and yet within that there is an oasis which is perfectly tuned to us because we evolved within it. And as Vandana said, the idea that we would pollute that and use all the resources and destroy them, I mean, if your resulting decision is, well, we've messed this one up, let's go somewhere else and do it again, you've got exactly the wrong end of the stick from what we are learning about the universe. That this is a place which is perfectly tuned to us if only we would respect it better. And so we look at that with our missions from above. We try to help understand the processes and the ways in which we're damaging the Earth, and hopefully learn how to stop doing that. But for me, in the space exploration domain, it's about bringing perspective. It's about saying, look, we are able, we are capable. It's awesome that we, as a piece of the universe, have evolved to the point where we can understand much of it. But the lesson we should learn from that is that, we are not very well suited to going and living around the edge of a black hole, let alone go through the event horizon and go into a library, which, I mean, what is that in Interstellar? I mean, it's all very nice, but, really. Now, let me just, sort of pause with an example. A few years ago, many of you will remember that we had a mission called Rosetta, which was European Space Agency's mission to Comet 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko. It was a long journey. There were flybys at Earth and Mars and asteroids. It was it was a kind of a cool journey, and we had two spacecraft, Rosetta and Philae. And we did lots of things to publicize that in ESA, with cartoons and all sorts of technical information. But one thing that we did do was make a science fiction film. We made a short film called Ambition, so it's 7 minutes long, in which we look back on Rosetta from the deep future. Who knows when? And it's really magical realism as much as it is anything else, but it's somewhere 1 million years in the future. Are these people even human? We don't know. They look like humans, but are they? And they're talking about the point of the mission, and the point of the mission was, as we focused in, was to find out how the water arrived on Earth. Where did water come from? It wasn't here when the Earth was hot. Was it delivered afterwards, or did it come out of the rocks, from underground? And we tried to set the scene also with humility, because in the film we don't show the landing on the comet. Because that happened, the film was released before we actually even tried, and so we didn't sort of do the gung-ho thing. Of course, it's going to work, so let's show the landing. No, but we chose to look back, and there's even a moment where one of the characters in the film says, "Yeah, well, I know all about that mission. There were bigger ones later. There were better ones. Why are we talking about this one?" So we kind of tried to set it in perspective as well. But it was from that philosophical perspective. What can space exploration tell us about our own origins? And by learning about our own origins and our own fragility and the fragility of the biosphere that we have, we should be humble, not emboldened to start marching off across the universe and plant flags. A, because it's not the right lesson, and B, because it's an awful lot harder than people think. Or want to think. And I think that's the critical thing. People want to think it's easy, and we've been encouraged partly through science fiction. Science fiction is partly responsible for that image that, well, we just strap into our seat and we go, and we'll be at a black hole and we'll go through it. It makes for nice stories, but it doesn't make for good science, and it doesn't make for good philosophy either, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point as to where to draw the line to not get carried away. Okay, so I'd like to focus on Professor Singh's work with METI, that's Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And in this context, I would remember the movie Arrival, where they described this language, this alien language, which is made of circular scripts and allows you, if you learn the language, it allows you a different perception of time itself, which was, I thought, was the point of the movie. But how, in that kind of a context where a language could change your perception of time itself, an alien language, how do you approach the problem of messaging an extraterrestrial intelligence?
Well, first I should mention that I'm only on the advisory council of METI. So, and that too only recently, and I've attended exactly one meeting. So I can't speak for the organization. But what I can say that it's trying to kind of complement the SETI program, which is where you look for signals of potentially intelligent civilizations from space, where you, and in METI, you actually try to consider the problem of sending signals. In fact, people have sent messages, I think since about the mid 1970s. And I think it's really interesting because again, it illustrates the entanglement between what we do on Earth and what plays out in space. Because in order to understand how to communicate with an alien civilization, we have to think about how we communicate among human cultures as well. Because there's so many things that are not universal in human cultures as well. And, we have so many stories of cultural misunderstandings and clashes of paradigms and worldviews. That's one thing. The other thing that can help us, of course, is communication with non-human species. And now that we are getting more and more decentered from the human and recognizing that there are intelligences of different kinds and that other animals have communication systems, for instance, dolphins and whales, but also more recently, prairie dogs, so-called humbler species, and also gibbons. So when we try to communicate with other species, what are the barriers in the way? What are the possibilities of misunderstanding? And that kind of can train us to think about how we might communicate with aliens. I really like the film Arrival, and even more so the story behind it, which is by Ted Chiang. It's called Story of Your Life. And it actually starts in reverse chronological idea, because in chronological sequence, because it really is a story about time and how we conceive time. And one way we can think about it is that different cultures on our planet have different views of time. Some might prefer the linear sense of time flow, others have a more circular or spiral sense of time, and so on. So within our cultural conversations on this planet, if we widen our imaginations through that, then I think we are more ready to communicate with alien civilizations. And it's a matter of, well, I mean, there's the infamous or the famous Drake equation gives us such a wide range of possibilities as far as the number of intelligent civilizations. And it only considers a narrow range of what we call intelligence, which is having a technological civilization. You could have plenty of intelligent civilizations that aren't necessarily interested in communicating with us, or that haven't developed and don't care to develop that sort of technology. So yeah, there's a lot to explore there, and it inevitably involves exploring us on Earth. It's also an exploration of ourselves.
So, what do you think of the cosmic postcard that was sent by Carl Sagan in terms of messaging extraterrestrial intelligence? Like, would that be effective by today's standards?
Well, as Doug Wyckoch, who's the president of METI, points out, if we assume that the aliens are a lot like us, like mostly visual communication and so on, then we will miss out because they may be blind, for all we know. So then you'd have to figure out how to send messages differently. And so I think that, and earlier on, people sent messages mostly through radio telescopes, radio transmitting devices, but what if they're not listening in radio or communicating in radio? So we look at other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum as well. And who knows, maybe I mean, I don't know if there's ever a technology that we can, gravitational waves are a whole other story. we know that's one way we can listen in to these huge cosmic conversations going on. Like when I say conversations, I don't mean among aliens. I mean, the motions of planets and black holes and things like that. But maybe somewhere somehow we'll find a way to carry or listen to signals on gravitational waves. I don't know. I'm wildly speculating here.
So yeah, it's a really interesting topic. So the Voyager golden records, in some sense, the symbolism there is important, because the chances of anybody actually finding that piece of cosmic debris in the vastness of interstellar space is tiny. In a way, it was about a projection of an idea rather than the sense that it would actually be found at all. I've been working with a documentary maker in Amsterdam called Stuart Ackerholt in the last few years, and he's been talking to people in the music community, including Philip Glass and others. If you were to make a new golden record today, how would you do that? What would you put on it philosophically? Because the original golden record was actually put together in incredibly short time scale. There was some degree of taking account of different cultures around the world, but it was really very sort of California focused at the time, and it wasn't broadly representative. So we worked with various musicians on this project, but we also thought, if you were to really do this and you wanted to send a new golden record out into space, perhaps a much more important thing to do would be to leave it somewhere in the solar system. Perhaps beyond the orbit of Jupiter, because when the sun becomes a red giant, it will expand out as far as Earth. But leave it in the solar system, because that's a place that people may come in the future. It's a destination, potentially, right? Rather than an empty point in space where you never find anything. And leave it as a memento mori, effectively saying, we were here once, we're not anymore, we've gone. This is what we learned. Rather than this idea of, hey, we're here, we're ready to join you. I mean, the chances of that communication happening are slim. Now, going back to the METI thing, we had an interesting example a couple of years ago. We worked with an artist in 2015 who wanted to send a radio message out, essentially along the same lines. We have trouble here. These are our messages. Don't repeat our mistakes. And it was to do with climate change and other things. And for the sake of symbolism, it was sent towards Polaris. We using our communications dishes. We had a couple of people at that point who raised the objection, which is implicit actually in the books we were talking about earlier on, the Liu Qijin three-body problem. One of the resolutions to the Fermi paradox, why, if there are so many aliens out there, why aren't they talking to us? Liu Qijin's idea is this so-called dark forest theory, that what you really shouldn't do is announce that you exist, because there will always be somebody more powerful than you. And even if most of them are benign, 1% of them are violent, they're going to come for you and stop you. And the reason that they would do that is because evolution proceeds on different timescales. One day you may become a threat to them. So the dark forest theory is, if you hide away, don't announce your presence, but at the same time, if you find other alien life which you're more powerful than, kill it immediately. It's a very dystopian view of solution to the Fermi paradox. But because we had a couple of people who'd read the book at that point and sort of said, should ESA be doing this? Should you be waking up the aliens with something like METI? We were then presented with an interesting dilemma when it came to another possibility. We were asked by the musician Vangelis, who wrote the soundtrack for Blade Runner and Chariots of Fire and so on, to send a message out with the words of Stephen Hawking to mark Hawking's death a couple of years ago. And our communications people in the European Space Agency said, well, because of this concern about waking up the aliens, maybe we shouldn't do that. Now, it's kind of crazy because we send out signals with exactly the same dishes around the solar system all the time, communicating to our spacecraft. So the very idea that one extra signal would be the thing that woke anybody up is stupid. But we were sensitive to that. So we asked Stephen Hawking's daughter, Lucy, to kind of interpret, to make sure that we didn't make a mess for the European Space Agency or for Stephen Hawking, who had spoken about this danger of waking up aliens. And as a kind of a cute thing, where we sent the message in the end, because we did broadcast it, we broadcast it to the nearest black hole, because that's what Hawking worked on. It kind of, let's send it to the nearest black hole, with the kind of science fiction idea that the message will just go into the black hole and disappear and never be heard of again. So, which isn't true either, but it goes straight past the black hole. But yeah, it had a huge amount of resonance with people, actually, not because of the meta aspect, but because the message of Hawking's words were a profound one about actually reflecting on the planet Earth, and this is the only place we know, and we should not mess it up. So yeah, we've kind of done accidental meta, but and I've met Doug a couple of times. It's a very interesting topic because it raises huge amounts of questions, not only about the way what message you send out and how you interpret it, but should you be doing it at all in the first place? It's an interesting one.
So we have a ton of questions from the audience. Let's go through some of them. Okay, I think. Right, so this is an interesting question. To what extent will science fiction shape ambitious future projects concerning space exploration? As in, does it help garner or generate the public enthusiasm, eventually the political will for funding space exploration missions?
Well, I think it certainly has helped ramp up the enthusiasm for it. Probably the films more than the written form, but often the films are made from written science fiction. So definitely that's part of it. And unfortunately, there's plenty of, I think, terrible science fiction out there that has inspired, terrible movies. Like one movie I expected to love, but ended up really, really disliking was Interstellar, which is exactly the whole colonialism in space message that we don't want. But certainly science fiction has the potential to inspire alternative visions of space exploration, that I believe.
Yeah, I have to say, I share. It's perhaps not fair. I know the person who did the special effects, Paul Franklin, for Interstellar, and I've never given it full credit because I've only ever seen it on an aeroplane screen. So I should. I'm sure it's very much more spectacular on a big screen, but it is a shockingly bad movie in terms of its philosophy, but also this sort of crux that there's lots of science and this whole business of involving Kip Thorne to model a good-looking black hole. And then at some point they decide to just sort of on the back of an envelope generate a whole new bunch of relativistic calculations in about 3 seconds, and then the resolution of the film is love is going to save us all. It's like, is this a science film or not? I mean, Star Wars, you don't have that criticism, right? Because it's not science fiction. It is cowboys and Indians in space. The other one, which is sort of bad in that regard, and I know it's not the book is a lot better, is The Martian, because again it's posited as being science fact told in a fictional way, but there's so many aspects of it which are just plain wrong that it undermines itself. Same with Gravity, really. I mean, but I'm very happy that Arrival was mentioned, because that is by far the best science fiction film of the last 10 years, because it doesn't really matter, all the technologies are relevant, right? It's asking the fundamental questions of what it means to be human and what it means to interface with things that aren't, and your assumptions and your presumptions. Of course, it's told in the context of a lovely story, the arc of her figuring out that time is circular, and the short story by Ted Chiang indeed is brilliant, as everything he writes, I'm afraid. It's fantastic. Yeah, and then there's another film which just came out, and it's an interesting one about what it means to die, for example, for human beings. It's a film called Archive by Gavin Rothery, who's a British filmmaker. He worked with Duncan Jones on the film Moon, which is another classic science fiction of the last 10, 15 years about cloning, effectively. But Archive just came out in the UK just this last week, and I won't give anything away because it's a film you need to watch and be surprised by, so to speak. But there's a lot of good science fiction filmmaking out, but the blockbusters generally are not it. I mean, you've got to seek out, the next level down. And there's so much good science fiction being written today which could be movie stuff if it didn't just fall into the tropes of Hollywood saying, well, show me the good guy and the bad guy and we'll have a fight. But even China's doing that now as well. I mean, one of the worst science fiction films I've seen for ages, but so bad that it's worth watching because it's fun, is The Wandering Earth by Liu Qijin, which is just utterly, well, at the risk of being rude, it's batshit crazy. It's just nuts, and it's just, yeah. But huge budget on special effects and everything else. It looks fantastic, but the story is just insane.
No, that was interesting. I mean, getting to know the difference between good and bad science fiction. Like, what inspires what kind of an outlook towards space exploration? I think that's the key. So yeah, a few more questions. Do sci-fi authors have to keep track of scientific accuracy, or do they use the artistic license liberally? I mean, how do you make that decision even? To what extent is it science fiction and then not anymore?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, there's a whole lot of variations on the theme. So, if you're playing with with science as a metaphor and you're kind of playing with it in a fantastical way, I would call that science fantasy. I mostly write science fiction. Sometimes I venture into, magic realism or fantasy, but mostly science fiction. So for me personally, it's very important to really know the science, and that's one of the reasons I love writing it, because my area of physics, which is theoretical particle physics, it allows me to go beyond that. Like I'm not an astrophysicist, so I have to learn stuff to know about what tidally locked planets around red dwarf stars are like, and things like that. So yes, and the science, to a science fiction writer like myself, where the aesthetic impulse is also important. It's not just the science of it, and in fact, the two are indistinguishable for me in some sense. For someone like me, the science informs the poetic conception of the story. And even if I take liberties with the science, I want to take informed liberties with the science. Just as if somebody commits a grammar error, that's different from somebody who knowingly changes the rule of grammar in order to create something artistic, right? So
Right.
I like to be an informed. I've written stories where I've imagined a situation where or a universe, an alternate universe, if you will, where the universe is not expanding, without end, and where it crunches back, which was an older, there have been variations on that theme. We think our universe is one where the expansion is actually, as far as we know, accelerating. So, or imagining situations where the laws of physics change with time. So having that sort of grounding in the sciences, and also having the respect for science to explore in regions that I'm not, that well versed in. I think that's important for the kind of science fiction I write, because then it allows, it's actually constraints that enable creativity to happen. So with science as the constraint, in a way, it's kind of a launch pad for creativity.
Right.
So yes, that's where I stand on the issue.
Yeah, for me as a reader, that's exactly what I want to read. Of course, there is fantasy, and you can read fantasy with, essentially ground rules which are independent of physics, but maybe sociological ground rules and sets. But
Right.
for science fiction, yes, I like to see people who are well aware of what the science is, but then push at it and say, well, what if, right? And without necessarily breaking it or going beyond what we might already understand. I mean, to be honest, if there's not enough inspiration in quantum mechanics and general relativity on their own to inspire fantastic views and thoughts. I mean, one science fiction writer who I would almost call it sort of almost crime thriller, but uses aspects of science fiction, is Blake Crouch, who has written several books which involve the the classic conundrums of time travel, of going back and being able to alter the past, and how the many worlds theory splinters off into various ways. I mean, again, without giving too much away, I just recommend going read Recursion. It's a thriller because it's a page turner, but there's a basis there which is physics, and it's kind of a logical consequence of the microcosmic world breaking through into the macrocosmic. If it operates down there, what if it really is operating in the world which is at the level of human beings? And there's no reason to think it isn't. The multiverse theory is a hard one to dispense with, but if that doesn't inform a billion books, the fact that there's a universe right now where we've had this conversation, and where actually I've stood up and flown out of the window here, because that's possible, right? There's a universe in which where that happens. It just doesn't happen to be the one where this call is happening. But another me at this moment actually has just flown to space and arrived at the space station instantaneously through quantum tunneling or whatever. I mean, just I'm making stuff up now.
Speculating.
There's an awful lot in the multiverse that you go for it.
It was an interesting conversation. Thank you, Professor McCaughrean. Thank you, Professor Singh, for this fantastic panel discussion. I'll